Many Black African diaspora youth struggle to belong in hegemonically white Australian schools and society. Previous research has identified African diaspora peoples from diverse backgrounds share experiences of racialised discrimination and marginalisation in Australia. Recent surveys have demonstrated a 20% increase in the recognition of racism as a significant problem in Australia, from 40% and a rise up to 60%, with almost 44% of respondents to another survey expressing anti-African sentiment. Within schools, African diaspora young people experience significant racism and marginalisation, which takes multiple different forms. The stories from participants in our study, which are shared in this video, illustrate some of the different forms that racism takes in Australian schools.
There was one time, me and another friend, she was black too, we were helping this girl on crutches go to the canteen. She was white. So we're holding onto her stuff because we're good friends, and the teacher passes us. She looks at the white girl and she's like, "It must be nice having slaves." I was like, "Excuse me?" And then she repeated it. That's a whole teacher. I was like, she wants to fight, those are fighting words. I said to her, "Don't ever say that again. We're not slaves, we're her friends." Then I ended up reporting it. And even when she was apologizing, she was just like, "In my family, we use words like that all the time. But I didn't even realize for you it might be, offensive." She looked like she was about to cry though.
Racism can be both overt and covert, and be experienced in different ways, including internalised, within the self, interpersonal, between people, institutional or systemic, such as policies, practices, procedures and cultures of an institution that advantage or work better for white people, and structural, when the institutional racism of multiple institutions overlaps to form a web of racism that impacts people of colour. This also includes social narratives about race, including those perpetuated by the media. Overt racism is explicit and entails intentional or obvious harmful attitudes or behaviours towards a minority individual or group because of the colour of their skin. It can be practiced by individuals, groups, institutions, and across societies. Actions like hate crimes, racial slurs, and negative stereotypes are forms of overt racism. Overt racist actions are those that are the easiest to see and describe as racism, unlike the more insidious or covert forms of racism. While Yvonne's previous story illustrated forms of overt racism, the teacher's attempt to explain her use of the word slave illustrates more covert forms of racism. Covert racism is more concealed or subtle rather than obvious or public. Covert racism is more disguised and allows for perpetrators to deny that the act was racist and undermine any claim of harm. Covert racism may also result from forms of unconscious bias within perpetrators who are not self-aware of their prejudices. Covert racism can be interpersonal, but is also frequently institutional and systemic. Examples of covert racism include microaggressions through subtle, indirect or unintentional acts of discrimination, school dress codes that don't allow for different hairstyles such as braiding, and making assumptions about students' language ability based on their surname, country of birth or skin colour all demonstrate forms of covert racism. Zamda's story that follows indicates how covert racism can operate in schools.
In year 11, I was struggling in school. I just felt like I didn't belong. I was pretty smart, but barely showing up to school. The teachers didn't really make an effort to keep me attending school. I was doing specialist maths, a subject that I had to do an exam for. It was worth like 50% of my grade. Come exam day, I did the exam. A few weeks later, they got the results. I had done really, really well. To my surprise, the teacher emailed me and told me to come in for a meeting. They had also phoned my parents, but didn't tell me. I show up to the meeting, surprised to see my maths teacher and the maths coordinator and the year level leader and the vice principal and the principal and my parents. The teacher pointed at me and said, there was no way I'd done as well as I did without showing up to class. I felt like time had stopped as I saw the disappointment on my parents' face. I looked at them and I said in Swahili, Wanasema uongo. She's lying. I didn't cheat. The exam was all my work. I felt like no one believed me. I felt like no one thought I was capable. In the end, they made me retake the exam the next day while my parents watched, and I got an even better grade.
The demarcation between overt and covert forms of racism and how they are experienced is not necessarily clear. Covert forms of racism are much more difficult for students to be able to identify and report. Covert forms of racism can also be much more difficult for schools to know how to respond to. However, understanding the multiple and insidious ways in which racism operates and is experienced is a first step.